In the stillness of night, when the world drifts into silence and only the faintest creak of wood or whisper of wind carries through the air, there is a sacred trust between parent and child. The cradle rocks, the lullaby hums, and the gentle breath of a sleeping infant becomes a fragile rhythm, the most precious sound a human ear can ever know. That breath is life itself, the invisible thread tying a child to the living world. It is innocence, purity, and the very spark of existence. But what if something unseen, something older than memory and darker than comfort, waited for that rhythm to falter? What if an object, crafted by human hands, yet carrying something inhuman within, could drink from that breath until silence was all that remained? For centuries, dolls have been companions of children. They sit quietly in cradles, tucked under blankets, their glass or painted eyes reflecting the flicker of candlelight. To us, they are harmless, playthings meant to mimic life. Yet, in the right light, they reveal something else. Their gaze lingers too long, their smile seems sharper than memory recalls, and their silence, so total, feels less like innocence and more like patience. In countless folktales and whispered accounts, dolls have been more than toys. They have been vessels, they have been guardians, and in the most sinister legends, they have been parasites. The story we are about to follow begins not with facts written in stone, but with shadows and fragments. There is no birth certificate for this tale, no museum placard to explain away its origins. It comes to us instead, through whispers passed down in families, through fragments of folklore recorded in the margins of old books, and through the haunted recollections of those who swore they once saw it themselves. A doll, not extraordinary in its appearance, not lavish or ornate, but simple, handcrafted, and ordinary enough to hide in plain sight. Yet, this unassuming form carried with it a reputation that grew darker with every retelling, the doll that fed on the breath of sleeping children. At first, the stories are vague. They speak of a village, somewhere in the folds of Europe, a place unnamed, forgotten by time, where mothers hushed their infants with trembling voices and crossed themselves before leaving a child alone in its cradle. They speak of nights when children slept soundly, only to be found pale and lifeless by dawn, their faces marked not by violence, but by absence, as though the very air had been drawn out of them. The villagers whispered of witches, of demons, of punishment from God. But again and again, the same detail surfaces, a doll present in the cradle, resting beside the child, its carved face watching with frozen serenity. To understand the dread surrounding such an object, one must understand how ancient and universal the fear of sleep truly is. In the dark hours of the night, when the body lies still, humans are at their most vulnerable. Breath slows, awareness vanishes, and the boundary between life and death thins. Across cultures, stories abound of creatures that sit upon the chest of the sleeper, stealing their breath. Night hags, shadow beings, spirits with cold fingers and hollow lungs. And so, when death visited the cradles of infants with no explanation, it was natural for villagers to see not disease or chance, but something malevolent crouching in the dark. And when an object, unmoving yet ever present, seemed to accompany the tragedy, it became the vessel of blame. But this is not only a tale of superstition. What makes the legend of the breath-stealing doll so unsettling is how it refuses to vanish with time. The story does not die with the village. It resurfaces in new places, centuries later, always the same, always attached to a doll of similar description. Parents awaken to find their children gasping for air, crying out that something leaned over them in their dreams. Collectors acquire the doll only to be plagued with sleepless nights, hearing the faint rasp of breathing in empty rooms. In modern accounts, skeptics dismiss these claims as imagination, as sleep paralysis, as coincidence. But the pattern endures, and the whispers grow louder. The doll is not merely an artifact of folklore, but a presence that continues to move through the world, silently waiting, silently feeding. And so we return to that image, the cradle, rocking softly in the dark, the child's breath, steady and fragile. The doll, small enough to be overlooked, watching silently from its place beside the pillow. In that stillness, we are confronted with an unbearable question. Could something so ordinary conceal something so monstrous? Could the comfort of a child's toy mask a predator older than language? The legend says yes, and those who have encountered it swear that once the doll enters a home, the nights are never peaceful again. It does not move when watched. It does not speak when questioned. It simply waits. And as the hours pass, and the world drifts into sleep, it leans ever closer to the mouth of a child, drawn to the soft and steady rhythm of breath, until the silence is complete. This is where our story begins. Not with certainty, not with proof, but with dread. With an object no larger than a forearm, yet burdened with a reputation as ancient as the fear of the night itself. As we follow its trail, through folklore, through forgotten tragedies, through the vaults of collectors and the whispers of the modern world, we must decide for ourselves what the doll truly is. A myth born from grief, a symbol of humanity's terror of the unseen, or something far older, far darker, and far more real. Since the first breath drawn by a newborn, cultures across the world have seen it as more than just a physical act. Breath is life. Breath is soul. Breath is essence. In languages ancient and modern, words for breath and words for spirit often blur into one another. In Hebrew, ruach means both wind and spirit. In Greek, pneuma is both breath and the animating force of life. In Latin, spiritus carries the same dual meaning. To breathe was not simply to live, it was to carry within oneself a sacred fire, a fragment of something eternal. And so, when breath was stolen in the stillness of night, when life slipped away without wound or struggle, it was understood as more than death. It was theft, a predator taking what was most sacred. Across the ancient world, myths arose to explain this terror. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, demons called the Utuku and Labasu were blamed for entering homes and draining the strength of sleepers. Clay tablets tell of incantations meant to drive away night spirits that drink the breath of children. These beings were said to press down on the chest, suffocating the innocent, leaving behind no trace but silence. In these stories, breath was not only life, it was sustenance, something that could be consumed by entities from the unseen realm. Among the Slavic peoples, the folklore of the Mora spread across villages like wildfire. The Mora was described as a shadowy figure, sometimes human, sometimes not, that crept into rooms at night to steal breath from sleepers. Mothers feared the Mora most for what it did to children. Infants were found pale and weak, gasping in their sleep, as if their tiny lungs had been drained. To ward against the Mora, families would scatter iron objects beneath the cradle, or hang protective charms above the child's bed. Yet, despite their rituals, tragedies continued. And with each unexplained death, the whispers grew. The Mora had fed again. Far to the west, Celtic traditions carried their own version of this terror, the night hag. In Gaelic lore, the hag pressed down upon the chest of a sleeper, drinking their breath until the victim woke in terror or failed to wake at all. The night hag's visits were so feared that they gave rise to a word we still use today, nightmare. Even now, the sensation of waking with pressure on the chest, unable to move or breathe, is described as a hag attack. In ancient villages, however, it was not a disorder of sleep, but the presence of something supernatural, a malicious being harvesting breath, feeding on essence. In the East, Japanese folklore speaks of kanashibari, the binding that strikes sleepers. Victims wake in darkness, unable to move, feeling as though a heavy weight presses on their body, squeezing the air from their lungs. Though modern science attributes this to sleep paralysis, in older times it was understood as the work of vengeful spirits, drawn to the vulnerability of sleeping humans. They hovered close, feeding on fear and life itself, leaving their victims drained and trembling. In every culture, the pattern repeats. Breath was not safe in the hours of night. Something waited, something hungry. Even in Native American traditions, we find echoes of this theme. Among the Ojibwe, Stories are told of spirits that could steal the soul from the sleeping by leaning close, drawing it out with a single exhale. To protect children, dream catchers were woven, not simply decorations, but barriers against forces that fed on what was most essential. Among the Navajo, evil witches were said to shapeshift into animals that crouched by the sleeping and inhaled their breath, leaving illness and weakness behind. The universality of these stories is striking. Cultures separated by oceans and centuries all tell the same tale: unseen beings creeping into rooms at night, pressing down upon sleepers, and feeding on the breath of the innocent. Whether they were called demons, hags, spirits, or witches, the outcome was always the same. To lose one's breath in the dark was to lose one's life. But perhaps the most chilling detail is how often these tales focused not on adults, but on children. Infants, their lungs fragile, and their defenses non-existent, were seen as prime targets. The stillbirth, the unexplained death in the cradle, the child who stopped breathing without cause, these tragedies haunted every society. And when science offered no answers, folklore filled the void. The night hag, the mora, the shadow that drank the breath of the baby. To grieving parents, these were not abstract myths. They were explanations, they were warnings, and they were threats that felt all too real. The fear was not unfounded. To this day, sudden infant death syndrome remains one of the most tragic and mysterious phenomena of childhood. Even in the modern age, with medicine and technology, infants sometimes fail to wake from sleep, their lives extinguished without warning. The ancients, powerless to explain it, turned to spirits and curses. They created stories of breath stealers to make sense of what they could not control. Yet in those stories, there is a strange consistency, a unity of terror that suggests something more than coincidence. Why would cultures with no contact, no shared traditions, conjure the same vision of a presence stealing breath in the night? It is within this landscape of universal dread that the legend of the doll begins to take shape. For if spirits could feed upon breath, if demons and witches were drawn to children, then why could such a force not inhabit an object? A vessel, a doll. After all, dolls had long been regarded as more than toys. In ancient Rome, dolls were offered to the gods as gifts of protection. In Africa and the Americas, dolls were fashioned as conduits for spirits, intermediaries between the living and the supernatural. And in Europe, handmade dolls were sometimes placed in cradles not only to amuse but to ward off evil. The line between protection and possession was always razor thin. And so, imagine the unease of a mother who finds her child gasping in its cradle, only to see a doll resting silently at its side. Imagine how easily a protective charm might be reinterpreted as the source of harm. The belief in breath stealers was already woven into the fabric of human consciousness. The doll was simply the perfect vessel through which that fear could manifest. The doll that fed on the breath of children is not, therefore, an isolated legend. It is part of a far older, far broader pattern. It draws upon humanity's most ancient terror that something unseen could take from us the very essence of life. It is a story not born in one village or one century, but in the dark corners of the human mind, where every parent has watched over a sleeping child and felt that fragile rhythm of breath, praying it will not falter. The doll does not invent this fear, it inherits it. It embodies it, and it carries it forward into every age, whispering across cultures and generations, waiting to be recognized for what it truly represents, the fear that even in our most innocent moments we are not safe. Every legend has an origin, though time blurs the edges, until history and myth are indistinguishable. The story of the doll that fed on the breath of children begins not in glass cases or collectors' vaults, but in the dirt-floored cottages of rural Europe. Here, long before industry or electricity, toys were not manufactured commodities, but intimate creations, fashioned by the hands of parents who wished to comfort their children. Wood was carved, scraps of linen were wrapped, bits of straw or hair were stuffed inside. A doll was not simply given, it was made, and in that act of creation, something deeply personal was woven into it. The earliest whispers of the breath-stealing doll point to regions of Central and Eastern Europe, where dolls were rarely innocent playthings. In these lands, the doll was often a talisman. Some were crafted as fertility charms, placed under pillows of brides to ensure future children. Others were meant to protect against evil spirits. Peasant mothers tied red threads around the heads of their dolls, believing the color would ward off demons. Farmers carried tiny effigies in their pockets to guard against misfortune. And in the cradle, infants sometimes slept with dolls placed beside them, not as toys, but as guardians meant to absorb whatever malevolent presence lingered in the night. But such guardianship could cut both ways. Folklore has long warned of objects designed to protect that eventually turn against their owners. It is said that when too much devotion is poured into a vessel, it becomes heavy with spiritual residue. Love, fear, desperation, these are not invisible to the unseen world. And in the story of the breath-stealing doll, this is precisely what is said to have occurred. A protective figure, meant to defend a child, gradually became corrupted, transformed into the very danger it was created to ward off. The earliest descriptions of the doll are striking for their simplicity. No porcelain skin, no finely painted eyes, no luxury. Instead, it was a crude figure, a length of wood, perhaps a carved spindle, wrapped in cloth to form the shape of a body. A small round head, faceless at first, later marked with little more than 2 darkened dots for eyes and a stitched line for a mouth. Its clothing was whatever scraps could be spared: torn linen, old wool, bits of fabric from a mother's apron. This was not a thing of wealth but of necessity, born in households where survival left little room for artistry. And yet, perhaps it is this very plainness that makes the doll so disturbing. Its ordinariness allows it to hide in plain sight. It does not dazzle or draw attention. It simply waits. Legends say that the first family to create the doll did so in grief. Their infant had been plagued by night terrors, waking with shallow breaths and cold skin. In desperation, the mother sought out a local healer, who advised her to fashion a doll from wood and linen, binding it with threads dyed red. Lay it in the cradle, the healer instructed, and it will draw the sickness from your child. The doll was meant to act as a decoy, a vessel to absorb the malice that threatened the infant's fragile life, and for a time, it seemed to work. The child slept peacefully. The family whispered their gratitude. But then, according to the legend, other children in the household began to suffer. A cousin sleeping nearby awoke screaming that something leaned over him in the dark. A neighbor's infant stopped breathing in her sleep. One by one, the children around the doll began to weaken, until death crept into the home like an uninvited guest. From then on, the doll's reputation was tainted. It was no longer viewed as a charm of protection, but as a cursed vessel. Yet, strangely, it was never destroyed. Families whispered that burning it would release whatever spirit had taken root inside, unleashing it upon the village. Instead, the doll was passed along, sometimes buried beneath floorboards, sometimes left on thresholds, sometimes even gifted to others in secrecy. With each transfer, its story traveled with it, growing darker, heavier, like smoke clinging to cloth. Scholars of folklore often remind us that dolls across Europe were seen as liminal objects, sitting on the boundary between toy and idol, human likeness and spiritual vessel. In some Slavic traditions, it was forbidden to throw away a doll, lest the spirit within take offense. In certain regions, dolls without faces were crafted deliberately, so no spirit could enter them through the eyes. The faceless doll was safe. The doll with eyes, however, could see, and if it could see, it could watch. If it could watch, it could hunger, and if it could hunger, it could feed. The breath-stealing doll, according to scattered accounts, always bore eyes, 2 small dark marks that seemed harmless in daylight, but turned sinister in memory. Families swore the doll's gaze followed them across the room, that its stitched smile looked wider by candlelight. Mothers claimed they heard soft sighs coming from the cradle when no one was there, and when children grew sick, the doll was always blamed. Over time, these stories hardened into legend. Villages told of families cursed by a doll that appeared in their home without explanation, a doll that moved silently from cradle to cradle, feeding upon the faint breaths of sleeping infants. Priests were called to bless it. Healers attempted to bind it in red thread. In some accounts, the doll was placed at crossroads, abandoned for travelers to take, a cruel passing of the curse to strangers. Yet always it resurfaced, always it returned. And here lies the heart of the mystery. Why would such an object endure? If it truly caused harm, why not destroy it? The answer, whispered in countless versions of the tale, is fear. To destroy the doll was to unleash what was inside. Better to contain it, to pass it along, to hope it would take root elsewhere. In this way the doll became less an artifact and more a contagion, spreading from family to family, generation to generation, never staying in one place for long. It is in these early whispers, the wood, the linen, the stitched smile, that we begin to see the doll not as an ordinary object, but as the physical embodiment of ancient fears, a vessel that crossed the boundary between protection and curse, innocence and predation, born from human hands perhaps, but animated by something far older, something that understood the fragility of a child's breath and hungered for it. There are places that never appear on maps. Villages too small, too remote, too forgotten to be remembered by history. Their names fade, their people vanish, and only fragments of story survive, whispered in folklore like a stain that refuses to wash out. In one such place, the legend of the breath-stealing doll takes on its most sinister and enduring form. It begins with tragedy, the kind that arrives quietly in the night, leaving no sign of violence, only the silence of a cradle that should have been filled with life. The year is uncertain. Some place the events in the late 18th century, others in the early 19th. The only consistency is the setting, a rural European village, a place of wooden cottages and dirt roads, of fields and smoke rising from thatched roofs. Families here lived close to the land, and even closer to fear. Child mortality was common. Illness, hunger, or cold could steal away a life without warning. Yet even among so much death, there was something unusual in what began to unfold. At first, it was one child. An infant, no more than 6 months old, laid down to sleep after feeding. The next morning, the mother found her baby pale and still, lips faintly blue, as if frozen in the act of breathing. There were no signs of sickness, no fever, no wasting illness. The child had simply slipped away in the night. Grief-stricken, the family buried their daughter in a small plot of earth beside the church. Neighbors offered condolences, but few raised questions. Death was, after all, no stranger to them. But then another child was lost, and another. Over the course of a single year, 6 infants in the same village died in their sleep. Each case bore the same mark. No wound, no struggle, no explanation, just silence, as if the breath had been stolen from their tiny lungs. Parents spoke in hushed voices about how the children appeared before death. Pale faces, restless sleep, shallow breathing, as if something unseen pressed down upon them in the cradle. The villagers began to whisper of a curse. Some blamed a vengeful spirit. Others suspected witchcraft. Rumors spread of a family who had once kept a peculiar doll in their home, a crude figure of wood and cloth that had been passed down for generations. The doll was said to rest in the cradles of newborns, a tradition meant to protect them. But after the deaths began, that tradition no longer felt protective. It felt sinister. One widow whose son had died in his sleep swore she had awoken in the night to hear faint breathing in her home, heavier, deeper than the soft breaths of her child. Rising from her bed, she moved toward the cradle and froze. In the dim glow of the hearth, she claimed to see the doll leaning at an angle. It had not been placed in, its stitched mouth close to her son's face, as though listening or feeding. By the time she reached the cradle, the child was still, and the doll sat motionless, eyes turned upward in eternal silence. She told no one at first, fearing mockery, but after other children perished, she confessed her vision, and the whispers grew louder. Soon, the villagers connected every death to the doll. Some said it had been crafted by a desperate mother who sought to protect her infant from sickness, binding the spirit of a wandering soul into its wooden form. Others said it had been a gift from a stranger, a traveling peddler who left behind more than trinkets. No one could say for certain where it came from, but all agreed that wherever the doll appeared, death followed. The families who lost children were urged to burn it, but they refused. To destroy the doll was to risk releasing whatever dark force resided within. Instead, the doll was hidden away. Some claimed it was buried beneath the floorboards of a cottage, others that it was locked inside the church, sealed with prayers that could never be spoken aloud. Yet the deaths did not stop. For years the village lived in terror of the night. Mothers kept vigil at the cradles of their infants, rocking them through sleepless hours, terrified to let their babies out of sight. Fathers carved protective symbols into doorframes, hoping to ward away the unseen. Still, the doll's shadow hung over them. Over time, the tragedy became so entwined with the village's story that outsiders began to hear of it. Travelers spoke of a cursed settlement where children never grew to see their first birthday. The village acquired a new name in local folklore, the place of silent cradles. Unlike so many places marked by horror, it eventually faded from maps, its people scattering, its homes collapsing back into the soil. What remained was not the village itself, but the story. A story that traveled, whispering its way into neighboring towns, carried on the tongues of those who fled. Some folklorists argue that the tale of the cradle deaths was nothing more than a way for villagers to explain the unexplainable. Sudden infant death syndrome, though not understood at the time, was common. A fragile child could die in its sleep with no warning. Yet for grieving parents, nature was never an answer. A supernatural explanation gave form to their pain, gave it a face, gave it an object they could fear, rather than an invisible void. And so, the doll became the scapegoat, an ordinary toy transformed into a monster by grief. But others are not so quick to dismiss. What makes the story endure is the persistence of details that recur across generations: the pale faces, the sound of heavy breathing in empty rooms, the doll's presence in the cradle. These details appear not only in this forgotten village, but in scattered accounts across Europe, separated by time and distance, yet eerily similar. It is as though the doll itself traveled, moving quietly from one place to another, leaving behind only silence in the cribs of the innocent. Whether one believes it a product of folklore or a genuine curse, the cradle deaths marked the beginning of the doll's reputation as something more than myth. It was no longer a household object. It was a predator, an object tied to grief, to whispers, to generations of fear. The forgotten village may have crumbled into dust, its name erased by time, but its story lives on, a warning carried in lullabies sung in trembling voices, a shadow cast over the simple act of placing a child to sleep. And in that shadow the doll waits, faceless and eternal, patient as only an object can be, feeding not only on the breath of children, but on the fear of all who dare to remember it. Legends rarely stay confined to the soil where they are born. They travel as people travel. They slip into saddlebags, linger in memory, cling to objects wrapped in cloth and carried across borders. The story of the doll that fed on the breath of children is no exception. From its whispered beginnings in a forgotten village, the tale did not die. It moved as quietly and persistently as breath itself, carried by migration, by war, by trade. And with every journey, the story grew new layers, new variations, but always with the same chilling heart: the doll and the silence it left behind. Historians of folklore remind us that the 18th and 19th centuries were ages of movement. Families uprooted themselves, fleeing famine, conflict and poverty. Soldiers marched across Europe, bringing spoils and stories from foreign lands. Merchants traded trinkets, charms and curiosities. In the chaos of such motion, objects of little value could pass unnoticed, stowed among belongings, gifted or abandoned. It is within this world of movement that the doll seems to have crossed borders, appearing in places far from the village of its earliest whispers. In Eastern Europe, stories emerged of a peculiar wooden doll wrapped in scraps of faded cloth, passed between households like a cursed heirloom. In some regions it was called the silent nurse, a figure said to watch over children, but the name was bitterly ironic. For in these tales the doll brought not protection but suffocation. A child left with the doll by their bedside would wake gasping for air, eyes wide with terror, as though someone had leaned close to steal their breath. Sometimes they woke, sometimes they did not. In Germany, fragments of the story appear in the accounts of traveling peddlers. One 19th-century pamphlet recounts a warning given to mothers: do not accept the gift of a doll from a stranger, for it may be the witch's tool to draw life from your infant. Though the warning was general, some versions make clear reference to a doll with black thread eyes and a stitched mouth. In one account, a soldier returning from the Napoleonic Wars brought home a strange doll found among the ruins of a farmhouse. His daughter adored it, until she was discovered lifeless one winter's morning, her lips blue, the doll sitting stiffly beside her pillow. Terrified, the family abandoned the doll in a chapel, but according to later accounts, it did not remain there. It was gone by the next season, and no one admitted to taking it. Across the Channel, in Britain, the legend took on a new form. During the Victorian era, when spiritualism flourished and the dead were believed to linger just beyond the veil, stories circulated of a doll that breathed when watched. It was said to come from the continent, smuggled in with other curios. Some claimed to see its chest rise and fall as though lungs existed beneath the cloth. Others swore they heard faint sighs when the room was quiet. Though skeptics dismissed these as tricks of the imagination, the doll's reputation was such that nurseries avoided accepting second-hand toys of unknown origin. Mothers were warned, know the maker of your child's doll, lest you invite a stranger to their cradle. The migrations of the late 19th century carried the legend even further. As families crossed the Atlantic fleeing hardship in Europe, they brought with them keepsakes and stories. Among the superstitions whispered in immigrant neighborhoods of New York, there were occasional references to the doll that drinks. Some households spoke of infants who struggled in their sleep, mothers waking to find small dolls lying oddly close to their children's mouths. Though such tales never reached the prominence of Europe's haunted objects, they clung to communities like faint shadows, never entirely disappearing. Collectors of folklore have long noted how legends adapt as they travel. In some places, the doll is described as a crude wooden figure wrapped in rags. In others, it is said to have been remade with porcelain, its expression frozen in a faint smile. Sometimes it is faceless, sometimes it bears eyes of black beads. Yet in every telling, one detail persists: the doll is found near sleeping children, and breath vanishes when it is present. That consistency is what makes the story so unsettling. Variations may alter its appearance, but the hunger at its heart remains unchanged. Even museums and private archives hint at this wandering legacy. In letters preserved from the late 19th century, curators write of receiving donations of unusual dolls with troubling reputations. Some arrived wrapped in multiple layers of cloth, accompanied by notes pleading that they never be displayed. A few of these dolls, described in inventories, bear striking resemblance to the breath stealer: simple construction, wrapped body, stitched features. Whether these were the same object or merely kin in legend, no one could say. But staff often noted the same outcome. Children brought into the museums during public events became restless near the dolls, crying inconsolably, until removed from the room. What is most chilling is how seamlessly the story integrates into the folklore of each place it touches. In Eastern Europe, it becomes another version of the Mora. In Germany, it joins the tales of witches and hexes. In Britain, it slips into the fevered imagination of the Victorian spiritualist. In America, it merges with the haunted heirlooms of immigrant families. The doll never arrives as a foreign intruder. Instead, it bends itself to the fears already present in the culture, disguising itself as though it has always belonged there. This adaptability is what ensures its survival. A legend too specific, too rigid, may die when it leaves the soil that nourished it. But the doll's story is as universal as breath itself. Every parent knows the fear of watching a child sleep, of holding their breath for a moment to listen, desperate to hear the fragile rhythm continue. That universal fear needs little translation. And so, when the doll enters a new land, the story finds fertile ground to root itself once more. Whether the object itself truly traveled, carried from home to home, or whether it is the idea of it that crossed borders, a meme of terror replicating through memory and folklore, we may never know. But what we do know is this: the doll's legend is not confined to a single place or a single time. It drifts, as restlessly as breath in the cold night air, seeking new cradles to haunt, and wherever it settles, silence follows. By the dawn of the 20th century, the doll had slipped almost entirely from the world of folk memory into something else, the realm of collectors. What once belonged to grieving parents and superstitious villagers began to appear in auctions, curiosity cabinets, and private museums, and with this transition came a new chapter in its legend. No longer was it simply an object of whispered fear in peasant cottages. It became a prize and a curse for those who sought the macabre. The rise of antiquarian collectors in the 19th and early 20th centuries coincided with a fascination for so-called haunted objects. Scholars, spiritualists, and thrill-seekers scoured the countryside for artifacts tied to folklore. In this climate, the doll resurfaced. Its crude construction made it easy to overlook, yet its reputation clung stubbornly to it. More than once, a dealer is said to have acquired the doll only to rid themselves of it within weeks, unable to endure the strange disturbances that followed. One such account comes from Vienna in the 1920s. An antique dealer, Herr Lang, obtained a small wooden and linen doll from a traveling family who begged him to take it. They claimed it had brought only misfortune to their household. Skeptical, Lang displayed the doll in the window of his shop. Within days, neighboring merchants complained of strange noises in the night. Lang himself reported hearing faint rasping breaths behind him as he worked, though no one was there. His wife fell ill with unexplained fevers, and most disturbingly, his young nephew, who often visited the shop, was found one morning unconscious on the floor beside the doll's display case, his skin clammy, his breathing shallow. Terrified, Lang removed the doll, wrapping it in cloth and storing it in the cellar. He later sold it at a loss, refusing to speak of it again. The trail grows hazy after that, but similar stories reappear throughout Europe. In London, a private collector of occult artifacts boasted of acquiring a doll from the old country said to drink from the living. He reportedly hosted seances with the object, inviting guests to observe it by candlelight. Some claimed they saw the fabric around its chest rise and fall as though lungs were hidden within. One guest collapsed during the sitting, gasping for air. The collector laughed it off, calling it hysteria, but within weeks he fell ill himself. His journals, discovered decades later, are filled with frantic entries about waking in the night to the sound of breathing at his bedside. He died in his sleep, his body discovered with no sign of struggle. The doll's whereabouts after his death remain unknown. In America too, whispers of the doll begin to surface in the mid-20th century. By then, fascination with haunted objects had reached a new peak, fueled by popular accounts of Robert the Doll in Florida and the rise of paranormal investigation. Among the relics traded between collectors of the bizarre, one description appears again and again: a crude doll, wooden at its core, wrapped in faded fabric, with blackened eyes and a faint stitched smile. Those who handled it reported sleepless nights, sudden illness in children, and dreams of suffocation. One collector in New England is said to have locked the doll in a trunk after his daughter complained of a woman with no face leaning over her in her sleep. The trunk was sealed, but strange noises, soft sighs, faint giggles, were reported from within. Eventually, the trunk was sold, its contents undisclosed. The legend suggests the doll traveled onward. What is most striking about these accounts is not their sensational detail, but their consistency. Time and place may differ, but the pattern does not: acquisition, disturbance, fear, and the urgent need to rid oneself of the object. Again and again, the doll passes from hand to hand, never remaining long with any owner. Unlike ordinary antiques, whose histories are easily traced, this doll resists documentation. In inventories it is unnamed, in receipts it is miscellaneous, and yet it always re-emerges, tied to the same whispers of stolen breath and restless nights. Some skeptics suggest that the doll's story simply merged with the larger tradition of haunted objects. After all, cursed dolls are a recurring theme in folklore. Why should this one be any different? But believers insist there is something unique about the breath stealer. Unlike other cursed dolls, it does not rely on spectacle. It does not move on its own in plain sight, does not throw objects or scream in the night. Its presence is quieter, subtler, infinitely more insidious. It waits, still and silent, until the house sleeps. And then, like the legends of the hag and the Mora, it leans close and feeds. Paranormal investigators who claim to have encountered the doll describe an atmosphere of suffocation. One researcher, writing in the 1970s, noted that upon entering the room where the doll was kept, her lungs seemed to tighten, as though the air itself was being drawn away. Audio recordings captured faint sighs, though no one else was present. Cameras malfunctioned, and batteries drained inexplicably. After spending a single night near the doll, she reported vivid nightmares of being held down, unable to breathe. She refused to continue her investigation. Collectors of cursed objects often speak of the aura surrounding certain items, a heaviness that cannot be measured but is felt. The breath-stealing doll seems to carry such an aura in abundance. It is not beautiful, it is not valuable, and yet it exerts a pull, a curiosity tinged with dread. For some that pull is irresistible, and they seek it out despite the warnings. But for those who succeed in acquiring it, fascination soon curdles into fear. They speak of sleepless nights, of feeling watched, of hearing the soft sound of a cradle rocking where no cradle exists. They watch their children with anxious eyes, counting each breath, terrified it will be the last, and inevitably, they part with the doll, sending it onward to claim another home. This is why the doll is remembered not just as a cursed object, but as the collector's curse. It feeds not only on breath, but on obsession. It draws in those who believe they can contain it, study it, or profit from it. And one by one, it proves them wrong. The doll cannot be owned, it can only be endured, until fear outweighs curiosity, and the desperate need to be rid of it drives its keepers to pass it along. And so the doll continues its quiet journey through history, unclaimed yet never abandoned, a parasite upon human fascination. For every collector who dares to touch it, the curse awaits, not in fire, not in fury, but in silence, in breath, in the stillness of night. Children dream differently than adults. Their minds wander into places untouched by logic, guided instead by shadows, symbols and fears too ancient to name. And it is within those dreams that the doll seems most at home. For though it may sit silent and still in waking hours, countless accounts suggest that the doll's true power reveals itself in the fragile world of sleep. In case after case, children connected to the doll reported similar visions: a faceless woman leaning close, a sound of heavy breathing in the dark, a weight pressing down on their chests, pinning them between sleep and waking. Some spoke of a cradle rocking where there was none. Others described the doll itself moving, not with jerks or sudden violence, but with the slow, deliberate grace of something alive. The details vary, yet the pattern is undeniable. Children dreamed of her, and too often those dreams ended in silence. One of the most haunting stories comes from a rural household in Wales in the early 20th century. A young girl, Mary, began waking in the night, screaming, clutching at her throat. When asked what frightened her, she described the doll lady who came to her bed. The figure had no face, only black stitches where a mouth should have been, and she leaned so close that Mary could feel her breath. Her parents dismissed the dreams as nightmares, until they discovered that Mary had been playing with a rag-wrapped doll gifted by a neighbor. They tried to take it away, but Mary clung to it, insisting the doll would be angry if they separated her from it. Within weeks, Mary was found unresponsive one morning, her lips blue, her breath gone. The doll, sitting in the corner of her room, seemed to gaze blankly at the empty bed. Another case, this one from Austria, involved twin boys who shared a room. Their parents reported that both children began speaking of the visitor, a woman who came at night and leaned over their beds. The description was eerily similar: faceless, wrapped in cloth, whispering in a voice too faint to understand. What chilled the parents most was that the boys' descriptions matched a crude doll recently acquired by the family from a distant relative. The twins began to deteriorate, growing pale, exhausted, afraid of sleep. One night, one of the boys awoke screaming that he could not breathe. By the time his parents rushed in, he had collapsed. He survived, but his brother was found lifeless in the bed beside him. The doll sat between the two cribs. Folklorists suggest that these dreams may be connected to sleep paralysis, a phenomenon in which the body remains frozen between sleeping and waking. The sense of pressure on the chest, the feeling of a presence, the inability to breathe, all are symptoms described in medical accounts. But believers insist that these similarities are precisely what tie the doll to something far older than modern medicine. The folklore of the night hag, the Mora, and the Alp describe almost identical experiences, a figure pressing on the chest, stealing breath in the night. What makes the doll unique is its physical presence in these stories. While the hag is usually a spirit, the doll is something tangible, something that can be held, moved, or passed along. And that makes it far more unsettling. As the 20th century wore on, modern accounts of the doll grew less rural, more suburban, but no less disturbing. In the 1960s, a family in Massachusetts reported that their daughter began dreaming of a doll with no eyes after being given an antique toy by a family friend. The child became terrified of her bedroom, refusing to sleep unless a light was left on. She told her parents that the doll breathed when she touched it, and that it wanted her air. The parents dismissed her words as childish imagination, until they too reported hearing soft sighs near the crib of their younger son. After the boy stopped breathing one night and had to be revived in the hospital, the doll was hurriedly discarded. Even in more recent decades, the dream motif persists. Paranormal investigators in the 1990s interviewed children who had encountered dolls said to resemble the breath stealer. One boy described a rag lady who visited his dreams, holding him down and rocking him as if he were in a cradle. Another spoke of waking with his mouth open, unable to inhale, while the doll sat on his chest. Parents who witnessed these nights often describe rushing in to find their child gasping for air, eyes wide with terror. And always somewhere near the bed sat the doll. It is worth noting how children speak of the doll compared to adults. Adults often frame their experiences in terms of fear, disturbance, or illness, but children describe a relationship. Some speak of the doll as a visitor, others as a caretaker, a few even describe it as a friend, albeit one with strange habits. "She comes to play," one little girl explained, "but she plays with my breath." This childlike framing makes the accounts even more unnerving, for it suggests not only that the doll appears in their dreams, but that it engages with them, forming a bond that adults cannot see. Psychologists might interpret these stories as projections of childhood anxiety, a way for children to articulate the fear of suffocation, of separation from parents, of the dark itself. But skeptics often falter when confronted with the uncanny repetition of imagery across cultures and generations: the faceless figure, the weight on the chest, the breath drawn away. These motifs appear again and again, as if children across the world are dreaming of the same intruder. And always the doll is near. Some investigators go further, suggesting that the doll does not merely appear in dreams but uses them as a doorway, that by entering the vulnerable state of sleep, it crosses into the child's mind, feeding not only on breath, but on the raw energy of fear. Dreams in this interpretation are not harmless fantasies but hunting grounds, and the doll, silent by day, becomes a predator by night. Whether psychological projection or paranormal visitation, the result is the same: sleepless parents, terrified children, and stories that refuse to die. The doll haunts not by violence but by intimacy, by invading the most private act of all, breathing in the silence of sleep. And that is why the dreams matter. For while folklore can often be dismissed as exaggeration, and curses explained as coincidence, dreams are harder to pin down. They belong to the hidden world of the mind, a place where reason falters and shadows linger, and it is there, in that liminal space, that the doll seems most alive. For centuries, children have dreamed of her. Some awoke screaming, some never awoke at all, and through it all, the doll remains patient, silent, waiting for the next cradle, the next bed, the next breath to claim. Every cursed object invites the same question: can it be destroyed? For those who lived with the breath-stealing doll, this question was not abstract. It was born of desperation, a plea to end the suffocating nights, the whispered breaths, the silent cradles. And again, people tried. They tried fire, they tried burial, they tried holy rites. But the doll endured, as though destruction itself recoiled from it. One of the earliest recorded attempts comes from Eastern Europe in the late 1800s. A grieving father, convinced the doll had stolen the life of his infant son, cast it into the hearth. Witnesses said the flames burned high and hot, charring the walls of the cottage, but when the fire was extinguished, the doll lay in the ashes unmarked. Not even a thread was singed. The man collapsed in terror, believing he had confronted not a toy but a spirit bound into physical form. He abandoned the house, never to return. In another case from Germany in the 1920s, the doll was buried deep in the forest, sealed in a box carved with protective symbols. Yet hunters later stumbled upon it, sitting upright at the base of a tree, the box shattered as if from within. The hunters swore they had not touched it, but one man reported that his chest grew tight, his breath shallow, the closer he came. They fled, leaving the doll behind. When others returned days later, it was gone. Religious authorities, too, attempted to intervene. In rural Poland, a priest was called to exorcise the doll after 3 infants died in the same parish under unexplained circumstances. He sprinkled holy water upon it, chanting prayers of deliverance. According to witnesses, the water hissed as it touched the fabric, evaporating into mist. The priest declared the object dangerous and demanded it be locked within the church. For months it sat there, hidden in a chest. Yet villagers claimed to hear sighs in the chapel at night, and some said the candles extinguished themselves as if the air had been drawn away. Eventually, the chest was found empty. Whether stolen or released, no one could say. Perhaps the most disturbing attempt at destruction took place in America in the mid-20th century. A family in New England, tormented by nightly disturbances, brought the doll to their barn with the intention of burning it. They doused it with kerosene and struck a match. Witnesses, neighbors who had gathered, later swore that the doll let out a sound, faint but unmistakable, a breath long and shuddering, like air leaving lungs. Terrified, the family dropped the match, but the flames only circled the doll without touching it, dancing in patterns as though repelled. When the fire burned itself out, the doll remained untouched. After that night, the family never spoke of it publicly again. Psychologists argue that such accounts are exaggerations, the product of fearful imaginations. They suggest that failed destruction attempts are simply failures of will, that families too frightened to confront their grief invent reasons why the doll persists. Yet such rational explanations do little to erase the chilling consistency of the stories. The fire that will not burn, the earth that will not keep it, the prayers that dissolve into silence. Modern paranormal investigators often point out that cursed objects resist destruction because they are not bound to their physical forms in the way ordinary things are. If the doll is truly a vessel for something parasitic, a spirit, a force, a hunger, then to burn the fabric or crush the wood is irrelevant. The essence would simply find another anchor, another cradle to rest in. This is why so many cursed objects are locked away, rather than destroyed. It is not the object itself that terrifies, but the possibility of what may be released if its vessel is shattered. In one chilling interview from the 1980s, a former caretaker of a private occult collection spoke about an attempt to submerge the doll in holy oil. The doll was placed in a sealed container and lowered into the liquid. For days, the caretaker reported strange disturbances, the sound of faint tapping from within the container, muffled sighs that echoed in the storage room. On the 4th night, the container cracked. The oil seeped out, and the doll was found sitting upright, its fabric dry. The caretaker resigned immediately, refusing to stay another day. This persistence has given rise to a belief among occultists that the doll cannot be destroyed because it was never truly created. In this view, the doll is not merely an object but a manifestation, a physical form taken by something far older than wood and cloth. Attempts to burn or bury it are meaningless, for it does not obey the laws of matter. Instead, it obeys only the laws of hunger. So long as there is breath to feed upon, it will endure. And yet, the attempts continue. Even in recent years, stories surface of people who believe they can end the curse. One modern collector, interviewed anonymously, admitted to trying to incinerate the doll in an industrial furnace. Temperatures reached over 1,000 degrees. The collector claims that when the chamber was opened, the doll was intact, sitting exactly as before, but the walls of the furnace were blackened, warped, as if something had drawn the very air from the flames themselves. He has since locked the doll in a reinforced case, refusing to touch it again. The idea that destruction is impossible only deepens the dread surrounding the doll, for if it cannot be ended, then it can only be contained, and containment is fragile. Locks break, boxes rot, vaults are opened by curious hands. Inevitably, it will emerge again, sitting silently, waiting. This is the truth at the heart of the doll's legend. It survives not because it is indestructible, but because destruction was never the point. The doll was never meant to be ended. It was meant to endure, to travel, to find new cradles, new children, new breaths. Attempts to burn it, bury it, or drown it are only preludes to its return, and so the cycle continues. Families suffer, collectors despair, priests and investigators fail. The doll endures, not as wood, not as cloth, but as hunger given form, a hunger that refuses to die. For every haunting story, for every whispered legend, there are those who push back. The breath-stealing doll is no exception. While believers see a parasitic relic that feeds on the innocent, skeptics and rationalists insist it is nothing more than a human invention, a patchwork of folklore, fear, and psychology stitched together across generations. To them, the doll's curse is not supernatural, but cultural, not magic, but memory. Psychologists are often the first to weigh in. To them, the consistent detail of suffocation, the heavy presence in the night, the paralysis, all point to one well-documented phenomenon: sleep paralysis. When the body becomes trapped between waking and sleeping, a person may feel unable to move, may struggle for breath, and may sense a presence looming over them. Across the world, cultures have interpreted this in supernatural terms. The old hag in Newfoundland, the Mora in Scandinavia, the Kanashibari in Japan. The doll, skeptics argue, is simply another vessel for the same fear. A child dreams of suffocation, sees the doll in their room, and the story writes itself. Doctors too point to more mundane explanations. Sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, has claimed countless infants throughout history. Before modern medicine, parents confronted with the sudden loss of a healthy child had no explanation. In their grief, they reached for something they could see, something to blame. A doll in the cradle became the scapegoat. Over time, the association hardened into legend. To skeptics, the doll is not a predator, but a symbol, a way for families to make sense of the senseless. Historians of folklore take this further. They argue that the doll legend is a perfect example of cultural transmission. In one village, a child's death is tied to a household object. In another, a similar tragedy sparks the same association. As families migrate, the story spreads, mutating slightly but keeping its core: the doll, the breath, the silence. The repetition across borders is not evidence of a real object, but proof of how human stories echo one another. We are all afraid of the same things: the fragility of children, the mysteries of sleep, the finality of death. Yet skeptics often stumble on the material evidence. Reports of an actual doll, or multiple dolls, surface again and again in private collections, museums, and personal accounts. Photographs are rare, and the few that circulate are often dismissed as forgeries or misattributed. But the persistence of a physical form troubles even hardened rationalists. If the doll is purely a story, why do so many families insist they held it in their hands, felt its weight, heard its cloth rustle in the dark? Some skeptics answer this with psychology. The power of suggestion, they argue, is immense. If a family is told an object is cursed, they will see signs of that curse everywhere. A child's nightmare becomes evidence. A draught of air becomes the doll's breath. An illness becomes its feeding. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures, hardwired to connect dots, even when no connection exists. In this view, the doll is a mirror, reflecting the fears we project onto it. Others approach the legend through sociology. In rural communities, objects often carried symbolic weight. A doll in the cradle was more than a toy. It was a placeholder for the child's safety, a symbolic guardian. When tragedy struck, the very object meant to protect became suspect. The betrayal of expectation hardened into a curse. From there the story spread, each retelling adding details, each culture shaping the doll to its own fears. But for every rational explanation, there remain troubling inconsistencies. Skeptics may dismiss one account as sleep paralysis, another as SIDS, a third as coincidence. But what of the collectors who tried to destroy it, only to watch the doll emerge untouched from flame? What of the priests who reported water evaporating on contact, the curators who resigned after nights of suffocating dread? To believers, skeptics are simply blind, refusing to see what fear has already revealed. The debate itself has become part of the doll's mystique. Academic papers dissect it as folklore. Paranormal groups present it as evidence. Museums flirt with displaying it, only to back down after outcry. Even within skeptic circles, disagreement brews. Some argue the doll never existed as a single object at all, that it is an archetype, a recurring cultural image born of collective trauma. Others grudgingly admit that the persistence of physical accounts suggests there may be more to the story, even if not supernatural. What cannot be denied is the doll's effect. Whether real or imagined, it changes those who encounter it. Children dream of her. Parents grow paranoid, watching cradles for signs of life. Collectors are driven to madness, priests to resignation. Skeptics may insist it is all psychology, but even psychology acknowledges that belief itself can kill, through stress, through fear, through the body's own betrayal under pressure. In that sense, the doll does not need to be supernatural to be deadly. Its legend alone is enough. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. If the doll is real, then it is a predator moving unseen through history. But if it is not, if it is nothing but story, suggestion and grief, then it has still claimed lives, still haunted generations, still shaped the way countless parents view the silence of a cradle. In either case, the result is the same. Breath stolen, families broken, fear passed down like an heirloom. So the skeptics continue their work, dissecting, rationalizing, explaining. They strip away the mystery, layer by layer, until all that remains is a story of grief and imagination. But for every explanation, there is another story that does not quite fit, another case that resists neat categorization. And in those gaps, the doll waits, silent, patient, beyond fire, beyond burial, beyond disbelief. Because whether one believes or not, the legend endures. And sometimes, legends have more power than truth. Not all who encountered the doll were families or collectors. Some came to it as scholars, men and women whose lives were devoted to understanding folklore, cataloging superstition, and tracing the shadows that haunted culture. For them, the doll was not simply a curse but a puzzle, a story to be documented and analyzed. But stories, like objects, have weight. And one particular scholar discovered that to study the doll too closely is to risk becoming part of its legend. The name appears quietly in archives. Dr. Elias Hartmann, a mid-20th century folklorist, known for his studies of European death lore. He lectured at a small university in Austria, publishing papers on burial customs, protective charms, and the persistence of nightmare figures across cultures. His students remembered him as soft-spoken, meticulous, with a fascination for the boundaries between myth and lived experience. And in the late 1940s, Hartmann stumbled across something that would consume the rest of his career, and some say his sanity. It began with a letter. In his surviving notes, Hartmann describes receiving correspondence from a retired priest in Poland who mentioned a cloth figure locked away in a parish chest. The priest claimed the doll was tied to unexplained infant deaths in the region, that exorcisms had failed to quiet it, and that villagers demanded it be hidden. Intrigued, Hartman began tracing similar accounts. What he uncovered was a scatter of reports stretching back centuries, whispered tales of a doll found near silent cradles, descriptions of suffocating dreams, families abandoning homes after strange disturbances. Unlike other scholars, Hartman did not dismiss these as mere folklore. He began to collect every scrap of reference he could find. His notebooks, fragments of which survive today in a university archive, are filled with painstaking transcriptions of oral accounts, newspaper clippings, even sketches of dolls described to him by witnesses. Margins are scrawled with observations, breath motif repeats, child death unexplained, possible archetype, or single object. At first his work was clinical, but as the pages go on, the tone shifts. His writing grows restless, his entries longer, filled with underlined phrases and questions left unanswered. Why do children describe her the same way? He asks in one note. Why the sound of breathing? In another, he confesses unease. Spoke with mother whose infant died. Doll kept by bed. She swears she heard sighs. I felt something too, standing in the room. Pressure, heavy air. By the early 1950s, colleagues noted a change in him. He grew withdrawn, avoiding faculty gatherings, declining to publish new work. When pressed, he spoke vaguely of an ongoing project that demanded all his attention. Privately, he admitted to friends that he was tracking the movement of an object, the doll itself. In scattered letters, he hints at acquiring it, though no surviving evidence confirms this. What does remain are increasingly fragmented notebook entries, describing sleepless nights, vivid dreams, and a growing sense of dread. One entry reads, "Dreamed again of the faceless woman. She leans close, watching, listening. I wake, unable to breathe. Always the same sound, not mine, in the room with me. If I am only imagining, why does it feel so real?" Another, more chilling, states simply, "Breath stolen, mine this time, or borrowed." Some researchers dismiss these notes as the deterioration of a man overwhelmed by obsession. Hartman was known to suffer from poor health, and some argue his dreams and suffocation were symptoms of illness. Yet those who have handled his notebooks remark on the unsettling feeling they evoke, as though his fear lingers in the ink itself. The most disturbing clue comes from his final entries. In the months before his death in 1956, Hartman's handwriting becomes jagged, words trailing into incoherence. He writes of locking something in a trunk, of hearing it move inside, of debating whether to burn it but fearing what release might mean. The last legible page reads, "Children dream of her still, she wants mine. Tonight, I will sit awake, and if she comes I will see her clearly. Perhaps then I will know what she is." Hartman never published his findings. He was discovered dead at his desk, slumped over the notebook, his face pale, his lips faintly blue. Officially, the cause of death was heart failure, but those who saw him swore his expression was one of shock, his mouth frozen open as though gasping for air. The trunk he wrote of was never found. What survives are fragments, notebooks, letters and testimonies from colleagues. To this day, they are studied by folklorists and paranormal researchers alike, both camps finding something in them to support their views. Skeptics see a scholar driven to delusion by his own obsession, his failing health manifesting in dream imagery and suffocation. Believers see the notebook as evidence of direct contact with the doll, his death the final payment for daring to study it too closely. What is undeniable is that Hartman's notebook gave the legend new life. Before him, the doll existed in scattered fragments of oral tradition. After him, it became something more concrete, a narrative stitched together with dates, names, and places. His work, however tragic, ensured the doll would not be forgotten. In trying to contain the story, he preserved it, and perhaps spread it. For even now, those who read his notebook sometimes report unease. Students who handle it in archives speak of hearing faint sighs in the silence, of feeling pressure on their chests while reading his words. One archivist confessed that after cataloguing the pages, she dreamed of a faceless figure standing by her bed. The notebook, like the doll itself, seems to carry more than ink and paper. It is tempting to view Hartman's fate as a cautionary tale, a warning to those who would study too closely, stare too long into the shadow. His life is proof that legends are not always safe in the hands of scholars. Sometimes the act of writing them down gives them power, and sometimes power does not let go. Hartman sought to catalogue a myth. Instead, he became part of it. His breath, his dreams, his death, all folded into the story of the doll, waiting in the margins of his notebook for the next reader to turn the page. Museums are meant to preserve the past, to take the fragile, the strange and the sacred, and place it behind glass where the public can marvel at it without danger. They are places of order, where history is curated and controlled. But what happens when something refuses to be contained? When an object does not submit to cataloguing, to tags and placards, but instead asserts itself as if it were alive? In the mid-20th century, the breath-stealing doll made its quiet entrance into the world of institutions, and if the accounts are to be believed, the walls of museums did little to tame it. The first recorded attempt came in the late 1960s, when a small private museum in Germany, devoted to folk art and rural superstition, acquired a cloth doll with suspected occult associations. The acquisition log lists it without flourish. Item #442, hand-stitched doll, circa 19th century, provenance uncertain. Yet staff members recalled unease from the moment it arrived. The director reportedly complained that the air in his office grew stifling whenever the trunk containing the doll was opened. A curator who prepared the display wrote in her journal that she could not shake the sense of being watched, even when she knew she was alone. When the exhibit opened, visitors were drawn to the doll more than any other piece. It was not beautiful, not finely crafted, yet people lingered at the case, staring at it with unease. Some swore they heard a faint sighing sound when they leaned close, though no recording devices ever captured it. A few visitors reported dizziness, a pressure in the chest, or the sudden urge to leave the room altogether. The museum, eager for publicity, initially leaned into the unease. Pamphlets hinted at dark legends surrounding the object. Tours featured the doll as a centerpiece, the guide spinning tales of breath-stealing and cradles gone silent. Attendance rose, but so did the incidents. Within 6 months, 3 separate visitors fainted while viewing the doll. 2 staff members resigned after experiencing recurring nightmares of suffocation. One night guard left abruptly, claiming he heard breathing in the darkened halls, only to discover the sound was coming from the locked display case itself. By 1971, the museum quietly removed the doll from the exhibit. The official line was conservation, fabric too fragile for public display. In truth, the staff had grown terrified. The doll was sealed back into its trunk and placed in a locked storeroom, where it remained until the museum closed years later. What became of it after the closure is unclear. Some say it was sold to a private collector, others that it was transferred to another institution under a different name. The doll slipped, as it always does, back into shadow. Yet this was not the last time it surfaced in a museum context. In the 1980s, whispers of it reached the so-called museums of the macabre, institutions dedicated not to fine art but to curiosities, relics of death, and the occult. These were the places that collected shrunken heads, taxidermied oddities, torture instruments, and artifacts of superstition. For them, a doll rumored to feed on children's breath was irresistible. One such institution in Prague briefly displayed what was believed to be the same doll. Unlike its German counterpart, this museum was less cautious. They placed the doll in a dimly lit chamber, surrounded by other haunted objects, and advertised it as the cradle parasite. Tourists flocked to see it, daring one another to spend more than a minute in its presence. Guides reported that visitors often grew pale, stepping back suddenly as though the doll had exhaled on them. But then came the incident that forced its removal. A school group visiting the exhibit reported that one child collapsed, gasping for air. Though she was quickly revived, the child insisted that something had leaned close to her face, whispering in a breath not her own. Staff dismissed it as panic, but the story spread quickly. Attendance dropped. The museum, fearing scandal, closed the chamber and sent the doll into storage. Once again, its trail grew cold. What is striking about these accounts is not just the pattern of unease, but the way institutions meant to be bastions of reason faltered in the face of the doll. Curators whispered of feelings they could not rationalize. Guards abandoned their posts. Directors who prided themselves on skepticism quietly admitted discomfort. In their official records, the doll was nothing more than cloth 19th century Europe. But in their private journals, their hushed conversations, they spoke of something else, a presence. Even today, rumors persist of the doll residing in museum storage rooms, mislabeled or deliberately obscured. Researchers occasionally claim to have glimpsed it, tucked among shelves of forgotten artifacts, its button eyes glinting in the dark. Some institutions deny having it at all. Others remain silent when asked. For believers, this silence is telling. For skeptics, it is simply another example of myth inflating an ordinary object. But consider this: museums by their nature are designed to display. Their purpose is to reveal, to bring the hidden into the light. And yet, whenever the breath-stealing doll enters their walls, it is eventually hidden again, locked away, removed from view. Why, if it is only folklore, why does it never stay in the glass? Perhaps the institutions, despite their rational facades, sense something they dare not name. Perhaps they understand that not everything belongs under the gaze of the public. Or perhaps, most chilling of all, the doll itself refuses the display. Objects are supposed to be passive, but this one, if the stories are true, seems to resist, as though it demands shadow, demands proximity to breath, rather than the sterile air of exhibition halls. Whatever the truth, the doll has left its imprint on the museums that tried to contain it. Visitors still whisper of fainting, of sighs of nightmares after seeing it. Staff members still remember the weight in the air, the oppressive silence that hung around its case, and though it never stays long in the public eye, its brief appearances are enough to keep the legend alive. In the end, the museums became part of the story, not protectors of knowledge, but unwilling accomplices in a tale that resists control. They thought to display it. Instead, they were displayed by it, their fear and resignation another chapter in the doll's endless history. Legends that endure for centuries do not simply vanish. They adapt. They find new voices, new mediums, and new victims. The doll that fed on the breath of sleeping children is no longer confined to village whispers or dusty parish chests. It has seeped into the present age, reshaped by collectors, paranormal investigators, and the endless echo chamber of the digital world. If anything, the modern resurfacing of the doll proves that some stories are too alive to ever be silenced. The first ripple of its return emerged in the late 1990s, long after its last confirmed sighting in the archives of European museums. Collectors of haunted antiques began to whisper of an object moving through private hands, a hand-stitched figure, small enough to fit in a child's arms, associated with suffocation, bad dreams and deaths unexplained. The stories followed a familiar rhythm. A collector purchased the doll at an estate sale. Soon after, their sleep turned restless. Guests in the home complained of heaviness in the air, as though oxygen itself thinned when the doll was near. Within weeks, the collector fell ill or abandoned the object entirely. Inevitably, it resurfaced for sale, always stripped of description, hidden in vague listings as antique cloth doll, 19th century. But the digital age brought a new element: documentation. Unlike the vague accounts of the past, the modern resurfacing was accompanied by online postings, forums, and even videos. Paranormal communities on early internet boards buzzed with tales of the suffocation doll. Posts described owners waking to find the doll not where they had left it, or waking mid-dream to the sensation of hot, stale breath against their faces. Some swore they saw the fabric of its chest rise and fall, as though it were alive. Skeptics flooded the conversations, accusing posters of fabrication, chasing attention in the anonymity of the internet. But the consistency of details troubled even the hardened debunkers. Different users from different countries described the same phenomena. dreams of faceless figures, the faint sound of sighs, the sensation of air being pulled from their lungs. Coincidence? Collective imagination? Or the same cursed object resurfacing, now amplified by the speed of digital rumor? In the early 2000s, the doll briefly appeared on auction sites. One listing, archived by a paranormal researcher, described it simply as antique handmade doll with unusual energy. The seller claimed that their child suffered night terrors whenever the doll was in the room. The winning bid was modest, but the buyer's identity remains unknown. Months later, another doll, suspiciously similar, appeared on a different site. The cycle repeated, sold, whispered about, vanishing again. Paranormal investigators began to take notice. By 2007, a few independent groups in Europe claimed to have tracked the doll through private collections. One group, based in the UK, released footage of what they said was the infamous artifact. The video, grainy and dimly lit, shows a small cloth figure seated on a chair. Investigators attempt EVP recordings, asking questions into the silence. The playback reveals nothing unusual, until the final minutes, when a faint, rasping sound emerges. Breath, slow, uneven, unmistakable. The group insists the sound was not present during recording. Skeptics dismiss it as interference, staged for attention. But for those who believe, the clip is chilling evidence. The doll's legend soon spilled into mainstream paranormal media. Documentaries, podcasts, and late-night radio shows covered it, often blending fact with fiction. Each retelling amplified its aura, transforming it from a niche curiosity into one of the most feared haunted objects discussed online. Collectors began to fear its name. Some swore that simply speaking of it too often invited dreams of suffocation. In one chilling account, a podcast host who dedicated an entire episode to the doll later reported waking in the night, gasping for air, with the distinct impression of fabric brushing against his lips. The modern resurfacing has also brought new theories. Some paranormal researchers argue that the doll is not a single object at all, but a type, a cursed form that replicates itself. In this view, each sighting is not the same doll but one of many, each crafted as a vessel for something inhuman. Others argue the opposite, that it is one object, moving deliberately through the world, choosing new homes, leaving devastation behind before slipping onward. Both theories only deepen the dread, for both imply persistence, intention, and agency. Online, the legend thrives in whispers and images. Photos circulate, grainy, often disputed, showing a simple cloth doll with dark button eyes. Videos claim to capture it shifting when left alone, or sighing audibly in empty rooms. Most are hoaxes, cheap imitations, designed to ride the wave of fear. But the real dread lies in not knowing which are staged and which are genuine. In the flood of fakes, the true face of the doll hides, waiting, unseen. The digital age also means the legend now travels globally. Where once it haunted only rural Europe, it now surfaces in forums in Brazil, in podcasts in America, in chat threads in Japan. Each culture molds it slightly, but the heart remains the same, a doll that feeds on breath. Parents post online that their children have dreamed of a cloth lady pressing close to their faces at night. Collectors trade warnings not to pursue certain auctions. The legend, no longer local, has become universal. And yet, despite the skepticism, despite the staged videos and false listings, there are always those who insist they encountered the real thing. A researcher in Canada claims to have tracked it to a private collection in the Midwest. A family in Spain swears their child stopped breathing in his sleep until they burned a doll inherited from a relative. And in hushed online corners, whispers persist of a collector who keeps the doll locked in a glass case, covered always with a black cloth, unwilling to destroy it, but too afraid to let it see the light. The modern resurfacing proves one thing beyond doubt: the story has not died. It has evolved, shifting into the new channels of our age, carried not by oral tradition, but by pixels and screens. And as long as it is spoken of, written about, searched for, it remains alive, perhaps more alive than ever. Because now, unlike the old villages where whispers died with the night, the doll has the entire world as its cradle. And in the silence of bedrooms lit only by phone screens, as children drift to sleep with glowing devices nearby, the legend waits, a sigh in the dark, a heaviness in the chest, a story whispered across time, still feeding, still breathing. Stories end. That is the comfort we cling to. We tell ourselves that every legend, every haunting, every nightmare must eventually reach its conclusion. But the story of the doll that fed on the breath of sleeping children does not end. It lingers, not because of physical proof, not because of photographs or specimens under glass, but because of something far more enduring, breath itself. Breath is the first thing we do when we enter this world. A desperate gasp of air announces our arrival, fills our lungs, declares us alive, and it is the last thing we do before we leave. One final exhale, one last surrender. Between these two moments lies the entire span of human existence, every heartbeat, every dream, every fear. That is why the doll's legend holds such terrible power. It is not about dolls or toys or curses. It is about life's most fragile, most intimate rhythm, the rise and fall of breath. For centuries, parents have stood over cradles, listening to that sound, holding their own breath until they hear it again. The terror of silence is universal. Long before science named conditions like sudden infant death syndrome, people reached for explanations. In their grief, they saw patterns, a figure in the dark, a pressure in the chest, a doll left near the child. The doll became a vessel for a fear too great to name directly, the fear that life can be stolen silently, invisibly, without warning. Skeptics argue that this is all the legend ever was, an expression of grief, a way for communities to give shape to loss. They point to sleep paralysis, to superstition, to the human need to tell stories when facts fail. They may be right, and yet, what troubles even the rational mind is the consistency. The repetition of details across centuries and continents, always circling back to the same image, a doll, a cradle, a child whose breath is no longer their own. What if this is more than coincidence? What if the legend endures because there is something real at its core, not always visible, not always tangible, but waiting nonetheless? Objects have been called vessels throughout human history. Sacred relics carry power. Cursed items bring misfortune. Perhaps the doll is not unique, but part of this same dark lineage, an object that absorbed fear, grief, and death, until it became something more than cloth and thread. Perhaps it is both story and reality, myth and presence, feeding not only on breath, but on belief. And that is the chilling possibility of the doll. It does not need to be real in order to exist. Belief sustains it, each retelling, each whisper, each time the story is searched, spoken, or written, the doll takes on new life. When parents in distant lands warn their children about it, when forums online argue over its photos, when folklorists like Hartman lose themselves to its shadow, the doll breathes again, through us, with us. If that sounds abstract, consider how many lives it has already shaped. Children who grew up terrified of their toys, collectors who abandoned entire careers, curators who locked it away in storage rooms rather than risk displaying it, entire families broken by unexplained deaths, forever associating their grief with a stitched figure staring silently from the cradle. Real or not, the doll has taken breath, in every sense of the word. Perhaps that is why the legend refuses to end. It is not about a single doll moving through history, but about the eternal human fear of losing breath, of being smothered by something unseen. The doll is a face we give to that terror, and faces once created do not easily fade. Even now, as you sit in your own room, perhaps late at night, the story lingers. You imagine the cradle, the child, the doll at its side. You imagine leaning closer to glassy button eyes that never blink. You remember your own breath, steady, fragile, the only thing keeping you tethered to the living world. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a question stirs. What if, right now, something is leaning closer, listening to that rhythm, waiting for a chance to drink it in? That is how legends survive. Not because they are proven, not because they are photographed, but because they leave us unsettled. They creep into the quiet moments, the silence between breaths, and remind us how fragile we truly are. The doll that fed on the breath of sleeping children may never appear in a museum again, may never surface in a collector's auction, may never be caught on camera in a way skeptics cannot deny, but it does not need to. It exists already, in whispers, in nightmares, in the stories we pass to one another in the dark. It is eternal not because of what it is, but because of what it represents. So perhaps the question is not whether the doll is real, but whether we can ever escape it. Every cradle, every nursery, every soft exhale of a child in sleep recalls its legend. Every sigh in the night, every dream of suffocation, carries its echo. The doll does not need to be in the room. It only needs to be in our minds, and once it is there, once you have heard its story, it waits. Breath is fragile. Stories are not. Stories linger, long after the lungs that told them have gone silent. The doll's story has lasted centuries, and it will last centuries more, carried from mouth to mouth, screen to screen, cradle to cradle, and as long as human beings fear the silence between breaths, the doll will never die. And so the legend closes as it began in the dark, with a cradle rocking softly, and a child breathing quietly into the night. The doll sits nearby, motionless, patient, listening. You lean close, straining to hear the sound of that fragile rhythm. One breath, another, then the silence. Is it only the silence of the story ending? Or is it something else? The silence of something waiting, watching, leaning ever closer in the dark, ready to take what is most precious. That question is the doll's gift to us, its eternal curse. It is why we will keep telling the story, and why, long after we are gone, others will whisper it again, because every breath is borrowed. And some things, it seems, are always hungry. Every story told must one day fall silent. Yet silence does not always mean an ending. In the quiet, in the pause between words, something lingers. The legend of the doll that fed on the breath of sleeping children is no longer just a story buried in the past. It has entered the bloodstream of culture, stitched itself into folklore, and breathed its way into the modern world. The question now is not whether the doll was real, but whether, by speaking of it, we have all become part of its shadow. Think of how legends survive, not as relics behind glass, not as lines in dusty archives, but as whispers in kitchens, at campfires, in the hushed tones of parents who caution their children. Each retelling gives the story breath, and in the act of giving it breath, perhaps we give it life. Folklorists like Elias Hartman tried to capture the doll on paper, to bind it in notebooks and footnotes. Museums tried to display it, to strip it of mystery beneath glass. Collectors tried to own it, to lock it in cases or trunks. None succeeded, because the doll, if it exists at all, does not live in fabric and thread. It lives in the telling. And if that is true, then we are all feeding it now. Every time you picture the cradle, the child, the stitched figure leaning closer, you give it a little more form. Every time you feel the weight in your chest while imagining it, you surrender just a fraction of your breath. That is the power of a legend, to blur the line between metaphor and presence, between symbol and reality. But legends also adapt, and what should chill us most is how perfectly the doll has adapted to the modern world. In centuries past, it haunted isolated villages. Its story could be contained, whispered only within a parish, or passed down through family lines. Today, with screens glowing in every room, with stories spreading in seconds across continents, the doll has a new cradle, the global imagination. Each post, each video, each retelling online keeps its lungs full. In a strange way, we have given it more breath than ever before. Skeptics will argue this is only a trick of the mind, a cultural virus feeding on fear. Perhaps they are right. But does that make the fear any less real? When a parent jolts awake in the night because they dreamed of fabric brushing against their lips, when a collector sells off their antiques because of one suffocating nightmare too many, when a child wakes crying that something was leaning over them, the outcome is the same. Real or not, the doll exerts power, and in folklore, power is reality. There is also a darker possibility. If objects can absorb meaning, If grief and terror can stain the material world, then perhaps the doll is not just a story. Perhaps it began as cloth and thread, but became something more through centuries of belief. Every child who died in their cradle, every parent who whispered the legend, every